Every neighborhood has one person who thrives on control. Someone who seems to feed off the power of telling others what to do. In our quiet suburban community, that person was Karen. She wasn't always on the HOA board, but she had always hovered around it, circling like a hawk, inserting herself into meetings and whispering her complaints to whoever would listen. Her favorite pastime was reporting violations, from slightly faded shutters to recycling bins left on the curb too long. But over time, it became clear that reporting wasn't enough. Karen didn't just want influence, she wanted absolute control. It started with whispers of dissatisfaction. She claimed the current board was weak, that they let too many homeowners get away with breaking the rules. She complained loudly about lawns not being uniform enough, fences that weren't the right shade of white, and holiday decorations left out a day past the deadline. At first, most of us ignored her. Every neighborhood has a complainer, and we had grown used to Karen's grating voice echoing through community forums and email chains. But then she ran for a board position. Her campaign was relentless. She went door to door with flyers, presenting herself as the savior of the neighborhood's property values. She exaggerated minor inconveniences into looming catastrophes, warning that our community was slipping into chaos. To some residents, her words stirred fear. To others, it was simply exhausting. Yet, in a small HOA election where only a fraction of homeowners bothered to vote, Karen's persistence paid off. She won a seat, and with it, the beginnings of the power she craved. From the moment she was sworn in, Karen's personality shifted. She carried herself with the smugness of someone who believed she had finally been given the authority she deserved. Rules that had once been interpreted with flexibility were now wielded like weapons. Letters of violation began to flood mailboxes for the smallest infractions. A car parked an inch too close to a curb. A flower bed with the wrong species of plant. A wind chime that made too much noise on breezy nights. Karen was behind it all. And she wasn't satisfied with just being a board member. She began undermining the HOA president, spreading rumors that he was too lenient, too friendly with rule breakers. At meetings, she interrupted constantly, twisting discussions toward her agenda, insisting that stricter enforcement was the only way to protect our investments. Her ambitions were clear. She wanted to run the HOA herself, to crown herself queen of the neighborhood. At first, I watched from the sidelines, amused by her theatrics but not directly affected. My house was in good shape, my yard well kept, my paperwork always in order. But Karen didn't care about compliance. She cared about domination. The more people resisted, the more she escalated, and soon her eyes landed on me. It began with a violation notice claiming my mailbox was non-compliant. It wasn't. It matched the exact model listed in the HOA guidelines. I contested it, and the board, still somewhat balanced, dismissed it. Karen didn't like that. A week later, another notice arrived, this time about overgrown shrubs. My hedges were neatly trimmed, but she had found a single branch sticking out slightly. When that didn't stick, she accused me of improper trash storage, citing a photo of bins neatly placed at the curb within the allowed time frame. It became obvious. I wasn't being cited for violations. I was being targeted. Karen saw me as a threat, perhaps because I had spoken against her at a meeting, pointing out her constant interruptions and manipulative tactics. She had marked me as opposition, and opposition in her mind needed to be silenced. The harassment grew bolder. She rallied her allies, neighbors who either feared her or were too tired to fight back, to support her crusade. Together, they pushed for harsher rules and increased fines. They began pushing for emergency votes, trying to oust the current president and install Karen as the new leader. But what Karen didn't know was that I wasn't someone who folded under pressure. While she schemed, I began quietly documenting everything. Every bogus violation, every false claim, every manipulative email she sent to the community. I spoke with neighbors who had been bullied by her, gathering their stories. And slowly a plan began to form. Karen thought she was untouchable, destined to take over the HOA and rule without challenge. But she underestimated me. She underestimated the power of patience, preparation, and a well-timed counterattack. The storm was brewing, and when it hit, Karen would never see it coming. Once Karen tasted authority, she refused to loosen her hold. The small victories she had clawed out of the HOA boardroom emboldened her, and soon her ambition was no longer whispered in corners. It was shouted in every meeting, every email, every conversation she could dominate. She believed she was destined to be the president of the HOA, and she would stop at nothing until the neighborhood bent fully to her will. Her tactics became sharper, more invasive. She introduced motions to increase fines across the board, arguing that heavier consequences would make homeowners think twice about bending the rules. Suddenly, a forgotten trash bin that once brought a warning now carried a penalty of hundreds of dollars. A mailbox painted the wrong shade of white wasn't a slap on the wrist, it was a bill large enough to make families panic. With every meeting, she spread fear. She dangled the threat of punishment over her neighbors' heads like a sword, and for many, it worked. People stopped decorating their homes for holidays, terrified of being cited for a stray light bulb out of alignment. Children stopped leaving their bikes in driveways, parents whispering warnings about Karen and her clipboard. The neighborhood began to feel less like a community and more like a prison camp, where she was the self-appointed warden. But Karen's hunger for power didn't stop at petty rules. She started pushing for emergency amendments to the bylaws, rules that would consolidate her authority. She wanted the ability to issue citations without board approval, to collect fines directly, to strip privileges from homeowners who repeatedly disrespected the HOA. And while these measures sounded extreme, she disguised them under layers of language about protecting investments and community harmony. To her surprise, she met resistance. The HOA president and a few remaining board members recognized her power grab for what it was and tried to block her. That only made her more ruthless. She whispered about them behind their backs, accusing them of being incompetent, corrupt, even negligent with HOA funds. She spread half-truths and rumors like wildfire, planting seeds of doubt until even neutral neighbors began to wonder if maybe she was right. Karen thrived on division. The more fractured the community became, the stronger her position seemed. She played the role of the righteous savior, the one who would restore order if only she had more power. And slowly, piece by piece, she chipped away at the resistance. I watched it all unfold, quietly, carefully. My own conflict with her had not ended. On the contrary, it had escalated. After her failed attempts to paint me as a rule breaker, she doubled down. She sent inspectors to my property 3 times in 1 month, each visit followed by laughable accusations. A crack in my driveway she claimed was unsafe, a garden gnome she labeled unauthorized decor, and even a complaint about the height of my grass despite it being trimmed exactly to code. It wasn't about rules anymore, it was about intimidation. She wanted me to fold, to pay fines out of frustration, to be another notch on her belt of victories. But instead, I kept my records, filed my disputes, and waited. Because what Karen didn't realize was that her aggressiveness was creating enemies everywhere. Families who once tolerated her began to grow tired. Elderly residents who had lived in the neighborhood for decades felt trapped in a world they no longer recognized. Parents muttered at playgrounds about how ridiculous the rules had become. And while most of them didn't dare speak up, they were willing to talk, to me. One by one, stories poured in. A single mother fined for a slightly mismatched curtain visible from the street. A veteran forced to repaint his fence 3 times in a year because Karen decided the color looked faded. A retired couple harassed over bird feeders that supposedly attracted pests. The more I listened, the more I realized Karen wasn't just overstepping. She was building a record of abuse, and so I documented it. Every email she sent, every outrageous fine, every whispered rumor I could trace back to her. I built a case, brick by brick, as solid as the homes we lived in. While Karen strutted around like a queen, convinced she was untouchable, I was quietly sharpening the blade of her downfall. But Karen's ambition wasn't slowing. It was accelerating. She called for a community-wide vote to remove the current HOA president, framing it as a necessary change for stability. It was clear, this was her bid for absolute power. If she succeeded, the entire neighborhood would be hers to command. And that was when I knew the time for quiet observation was ending. Karen had made her move. Now it was time to prepare mine. The campaign for the HOA presidency was unlike anything our community had ever seen. In past years, elections had been quiet affairs, low turnout, polite handshakes, neighbors voting for whoever volunteered to serve. But with Karen in the picture, that peace was shattered. She transformed the election into a war, drumming up fear and resentment like a politician on the national stage. Her flyers painted the current president as incompetent, claiming he was allowing standards to slip. She accused him of favoritism, alleging he overlooked violations for his friends. She promised to bring strength and order back to the neighborhood, declaring that only she had the courage to enforce the rules properly. For some, her words stirred real concern. For others, they were nothing but noise. But the sheer volume of her campaign made it impossible to ignore. She began hosting informal meetings at her house, gatherings where she rallied her supporters with coffee, pastries, and plenty of venom. Those who attended told me later how she spoke with the authority of a general, instructing them to spread her message, to talk to their neighbors, to make sure the vote went her way. She wasn't campaigning. She was recruiting soldiers. The sitting president, weary of the drama, tried to run a clean campaign. He emphasized fairness, community spirit, and the importance of balance. But compared to Karen's relentless storm, his words seemed quiet, almost invisible. He underestimated her hunger, and in doing so, he gave her room to grow. Meanwhile, I watched from the sidelines, keeping my distance. Karen had already targeted me, and I knew she was waiting for me to speak out so she could use me as an example of troublemakers resisting order. Instead, I remained silent, letting her believe I was beaten down by her tactics. What she didn't see was the network I was building quietly, piece by piece. Neighbors who had been victims of her harassment began to trust me with their stories. I gathered written statements, photos of absurd citations, even recordings of Karen berating residents during inspections. Each piece of evidence went into a file that was growing thicker by the day. I also began attending her informal meetings, not as a participant, but as an observer. Neighbors loyal to me slipped me recordings and notes, detailing exactly how Karen twisted facts, exaggerated issues, and spread lies about the board. She was laying the groundwork for her takeover, but in the process, she was leaving behind a trail of manipulation, a trail I would eventually use to dismantle her. The election drew closer, and with it, the tension in the neighborhood grew unbearable. Karen strutted through the streets with her allies, knocking on doors, flashing her trademark smile that never reached her eyes. Families whispered nervously about what would happen if she won. Some believed resistance was futile, that she was destined to seize power. Others quietly hoped for a miracle. On election night, the turnout was higher than anyone had expected. The clubhouse buzzed with chatter. Neighbors gathered in clusters, some whispering nervously, others glaring across the room at those they considered the enemy. Karen basked in the attention, holding court with her supporters, already acting as though the title was hers. When the votes were counted, Karen didn't win outright, but she came dangerously close. The margin was razor thin, and the result was a divided community. She didn't have the presidency yet, but she had momentum. She had a faction. She had enough power to destabilize everything. And she knew it. In the weeks that followed, Karen doubled down. She claimed the vote was evidence that half the community supported her vision, and she used that as leverage to push her agenda harder than ever. The board was paralyzed, caught between appeasing her faction and maintaining order. Meetings descended into shouting matches, accusations flying across the table like daggers. Karen thrived in the chaos. The more fractured we became, the stronger she seemed. But what she didn't realize was that every outrageous demand, every manipulative tactic, every whispered lie was being recorded, documented, and filed away. She thought she was untouchable, but I was already building the counterattack that would turn her power against her. The time wasn't right to strike. Not yet. She was drunk on her near victory, arrogant and careless. I needed her to overreach, to reveal the full extent of her hunger for control. And soon enough, she would. Because Karen was never satisfied with almost. She wanted everything. And in her greed, she would create the perfect conditions for her downfall. The trap was nearly ready. All I had to do was wait. Karen's near win in the election lit a fire beneath her. She no longer acted like a simple board member fighting for influence. She carried herself like the rightful president of the HOA, convinced the neighborhood had spoken and that her rule was inevitable. The boardroom became her stage, and every meeting was another performance where she tightened her grip, undermined her rivals, and expanded her reach. Her first move was a push for new rules, radical amendments to the HOA bylaws that gave her faction greater authority. She proposed immediate fines for any violation without the need for board approval, mandatory inspections of every property twice a year, and a steep increase in fees to fund enforcement. The language was dressed up in vague terms about protecting property values, but the intent was obvious. Karen wanted unchecked power. For a time, her supporters cheered her on. They were swept up in the fear she created, convinced that without her, the neighborhood would collapse into disorder. But cracks began to show. Families hit with outrageous fines started whispering their doubts. Elderly residents complained about inspectors trespassing on their lawns. Parents grew angry when their children's toys left outside overnight were cited as violations. Slowly, Karen's base began to shrink. Yet instead of softening her stance, she doubled down. Karen thrived on conflict, and the more resistance she encountered, the more aggressive she became. She called emergency meetings late at night, hoping to wear down opposition. She flooded inboxes with long, scathing emails attacking anyone who dared question her authority. And when she couldn't win arguments, she resorted to intimidation. Threats of legal action, exaggerated claims about foreclosures, whispered rumors about her enemies. It was during this frenzy of overreach that she made her most critical mistake. At one board meeting, in front of dozens of homeowners, Karen lost her composure. Frustrated by resistance, she snapped, raising her voice, belittling the president, and outright declaring that if people didn't like her rules, they could find another neighborhood to live in. The room fell silent. For the first time, many saw not a leader, but a bully who viewed the community as her kingdom. And in that silence, something shifted. Neighbors who had once been afraid of her now saw her clearly. The fear began to crumble, replaced by resentment. People who had been quietly gathering in living rooms to complain about Karen started speaking louder, asking why one person should have so much control. The tide was turning, and Karen couldn't see it. While she burned bridges, I worked quietly in the background. My file on Karen was no longer a small collection. It was a mountain. I had screenshots of her manipulative emails, copies of her bogus citations, testimonies from homeowners she had harassed, and recordings of her outbursts at meetings. Every scrap of evidence painted the picture of a tyrant obsessed with power, willing to bend and break the rules she claimed to defend. The opportunity to use it came sooner than I expected. Karen announced her boldest move yet. She demanded a special election to remove the current HOA president and install herself in his place. She framed it as restoring order, claiming the community couldn't afford to wait until the next regular election. To her, it was the final step in her rise. To me, it was the moment I had been waiting for. The announcement sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Supporters rallied, detractors fumed, and everyone else braced for yet another exhausting conflict. But this time, I was ready. Quietly, I began reaching out to neighbors, sharing pieces of what I had collected. At first, just small things, an outrageous fine here, a manipulative email there, enough to spark doubt. Then, as the special election drew closer, I spread more. Recordings of Karen berating residents, photos of inspectors she had sent onto people's lawns without permission, leaked drafts of her proposed rule changes that revealed just how extreme her vision really was. The effect was electric. Neighbors who had been silent began to speak up. The elderly couple fined for bird feeders told their story at a community gathering. The single mother harassed over her curtains shared her emails with others. One by one, Karen's victims stepped into the light, and the picture became clear. This wasn't about protecting the neighborhood. This was about Karen's obsession with control. By the time the night of the special election arrived, the community was buzzing with tension. Karen still carried herself like victory was inevitable, smiling smugly as she entered the clubhouse, flanked by her remaining allies. But the atmosphere in the room was different now. The crowd wasn't fearful. It was restless, simmering, ready for something to break. And I had the match that would light the fire. The night of the special election was thick with anticipation, the kind of atmosphere where every cough, every shuffle of papers, every whispered exchange felt amplified. The clubhouse had never been so crowded. Folding chairs filled every corner, and still, people stood pressed against the back walls. The air buzzed with a nervous energy, the weight of weeks of tension pressing down on the room. Karen entered like a queen arriving at her coronation. Her posture was straight, her smile tight, and her eyes scanned the room as though she was already measuring the curtains for her new office. She wore confidence like armor, believing she had already won. Her allies followed closely, nodding, whispering affirmations, trying to bolster the illusion that the neighborhood still stood behind her. But beneath that illusion was a current she couldn't feel. A quiet, growing resistance that had spread like wildfire over the past weeks. It was in the stolen glances, the hushed conversations, the folded papers clutched in people's hands. The room was no longer hers. The meeting began with routine formalities, but no one cared for them. Every person in that clubhouse was waiting for the vote. Karen wasted no time, stepping forward, her voice dripping with manufactured authority as she declared the need for change. She spoke of restoring order, of taking decisive action, of preserving the neighborhood's value. Her words rolled off with practiced ease, the same lines she had repeated endlessly, but this time they no longer struck fear. They rang hollow, tired, worn thin from overuse. Still, she pressed on, leaning into theatrics, raising her voice at just the right moments, glancing toward the crowd as if expecting applause. Some of her allies clapped nervously, but their numbers were smaller now. The silence that followed each burst of forced applause was deafening, and yet Karen, blinded by her ego, mistook it for obedience. When she finally called for the vote, the room tensed. Ballots were passed, hands moved swiftly, and for a moment it seemed as though Karen's plan might succeed by sheer momentum. She waited with smug satisfaction, convinced the outcome was sealed. But before the ballots could be counted, I stood up. All eyes turned. The room, already tense, grew still. Karen's smile flickered for the first time, a flash of irritation crossing her face. She hadn't expected this. She thought the night belonged entirely to her. I held nothing dramatic in my hands, just a folder, thick with paper. Evidence, weeks, months of it. My voice cut through the silence as I began to speak, not with fire or anger, but with the steady, measured tone of someone who has come prepared. I told the room what I had uncovered. I spoke of the unjust fines, the families burdened with threats over bird feeders and children's toys. I described the intimidation, the inspections carried out without consent, the endless flood of harassing emails. With each point, I held up proof, photographs, screenshots, letters. The folder spilled onto the table, a dam breaking open, releasing everything Karen had worked so hard to hide. And then, I played the recording. Karen's voice, sharp and venomous, filled the clubhouse speakers. Her words, "Find another neighborhood to live in," echoed in the room. There was no denying it, no spinning it into something else. The mask she had worn for so long cracked in an instant, and for the first time people saw her without the polish, without the pretense. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Murmurs rose, louder and louder, turning into angry voices, accusations, demands. Karen tried to regain control, raising her hands, shouting over the noise, but it was too late. The room was no longer hers. The neighbors she had ruled with fear now turned on her with fury. The ballots were still counted, but the outcome was already decided before the final paper was read aloud. Karen lost, and not by a narrow margin, but in a landslide. The community had rejected her. Her dream of power had shattered right there in the same room where she had once stood untouchable. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she gathered her things. She tried to speak, to launch one last desperate tirade, but the words fell flat. Nobody listened anymore. The queen of the HOA had been dethroned, and she walked out of the clubhouse not as a leader, but as a pariah. As the meeting dissolved into chatter and relief, I slipped quietly back into my seat. The job wasn't finished. Not yet. Karen had been beaten, but people like her rarely vanish without a fight. The final chapter of this war was still waiting, and I knew she wouldn't go quietly. Defeat should have ended it. For most people, losing so decisively in front of the entire community would have been enough to break their ambition, enough to send them retreating into the shadows. But Karen was not like most people. She was the kind who fed on conflict, who thrived on manipulation, who could not accept the idea of being ordinary. The night of the election had stripped her of her crown, but in her mind, the throne still belonged to her. In the days that followed, she refused to accept the results. She claimed the election was rigged, that ballots had been tampered with, that her enemies had conspired to silence her leadership. She bombarded the neighborhood with angry emails, filled with accusations and threats of lawsuits. She went door to door, demanding neighbors sign petitions for her reinstatement, her face twisted with desperation as she tried to claw back the power she had lost. At first, some ignored her, hoping she would burn herself out. But Karen only grew louder. She filed frivolous complaints against board members, accused residents of criminal behavior, and even called the city inspector to harass homeowners she believed had turned against her. What had once been ambition had curdled into obsession. The neighborhood grew weary. People who had celebrated her downfall now felt the shadow of her presence linger, poisoning the air. It wasn't enough to have beaten her. She needed to be stopped, permanently. And that was when I knew it was time for the counterattack I had been saving. For months, my file on Karen had been growing. Her lies, her manipulations, her abuses. But there were pieces I hadn't revealed yet, fragments of her personal hypocrisy that cut deeper than any recording or fine. She had spent years preaching about property values, about protecting the beauty of the neighborhood, about enforcing rules on others. Yet behind closed doors, she lived by none of them. Her backyard was a swamp of code violations, unregistered sheds, rotting fences, garbage piled where no one could see. Her impeccable home was riddled with neglected repairs. She had funneled HOA funds into pet projects that benefited her friends. I had it all: photos, receipts, testimony. And now, when the neighborhood was most ready to be rid of her, I brought it forward. The board called a special meeting, not to discuss elections or rules, but to address Karen herself. The room was packed once again, though the atmosphere was different this time. Less tense, more resolute. The community wasn't afraid anymore. They wanted closure. They wanted freedom. When her file was presented, the reaction was swift. The images of her unkempt backyard drew gasps. The evidence of misused funds drew outrage. The hypocrisy was too glaring to ignore. Karen sat in the front row, her face drained of color, as the walls of her carefully constructed empire crumbled piece by piece. She tried to protest, to shout over the evidence, but every word only dug her hole deeper. By the end of the night, the board voted unanimously. Karen was banned from holding any position in the HOA for life. The decision was final, and there was nothing she could do to appeal it. For the first time, her threats carried no weight. The power she had clung to so desperately slipped from her grasp, leaving her with nothing but the bitter taste of her own downfall. Afterward, the neighborhood felt different. The fear that had hung over us for so long evaporated, replaced by a quiet relief. Neighbors who had once hidden behind closed doors began gathering again, sharing stories, laughing, rebuilding the sense of community Karen had nearly destroyed. As for Karen, she faded into the background. She still lived there, of course, but her presence no longer commanded attention. She was just another homeowner, stripped of her influence, her reputation in tatters. Occasionally I would see her in her yard, glaring at passers-by, muttering to herself. But her empire was gone, and in its place stood a neighborhood that had learned the strength of standing together. For me, it was never about revenge for its own sake. It was about showing Karen that no one person could rule by fear forever. Power built on intimidation always cracks, and when it does, it falls harder than anyone expects. She had tried to take over our HOA, to crown herself queen of our neighborhood. But in the end, she never saw my counterattack coming. And when it landed, it wasn't just me who won. It was all of us.